Well, first the government has to provide the spaces for civil society to be able to participate, because if those formal spaces are not there, it is quite difficult to advocate to government directly, because there are ways of doing it in a parallel way. You do advocacies outside, but it's better when you're doing it inside government, because government is mainly responsible for implementing the SDGs, making the plans, doing the budgets. So that kind of engagement is very important. If the government cannot provide that space, we always have to fight for those spaces. So in the Philippines, we have some spaces at different levels of government because, for example, the local government code actually allows civil society participation in most of the local development councils. But the problem is the SDGs are not known to local government officials yet. I mean, it's not really that popular yet. So we engage in many ways. We do alternative budgets, you know. We try to find ways to influence politicians, meaning legislative, so that we'll be able to get our budgets in and our ideas across. But there's a lot to be done in terms of the government being sensitive to the SDGs. Some of the plans are not really SDG sensitive yet. And it also has to be complemented by people being able to learn what the SDGs are all about. So in the early years, we'll call it the early years because it's just 2 years yet. So we're pushing for those spaces, yeah. Well, from this meeting, I think it's very important for the governments and civil society to be able to interact, and for the UN also to hear what civil society feels so that it will be able to support, for example, areas of policy coherence and areas of implementation where participation is being maximized. So I think this kind of exchange provides us with a network of, you know, people that we can speak to. It expands our horizons in terms of what we can envision for our own SDG advocacies. So it's good to have that kind of interaction and exchanges because it's a good learning tool. Well, UNDP, of course, with the partnerships that they are doing in terms of their own programs, I think it is very important for UNDP to be able to sensitize its plans and programs. For example, influencing the UNDAF, and for civil society to have that space, that policy space, to be able to input into their program documents, not only in the implementation, not only in the planning, but also in evaluating through the years what has happened to the SDGs, what the civil society thinks, and what social movements, which are grassroots and community-based organizations, are actually feeling or feeling the impact of in terms of the implementation by government. So it's an important role that UNDP has to facilitate, not only in terms of knowledge, but actual program support. It's very interesting to see the practices, for example, of Pakistan, Indonesia, the way they're actually mainstreaming the planning of the SDGs and actually having a law, for example, in Indonesia, where it's decreed that participation of several sectors, multi-stakeholders, is decreed. No? So it's interesting. So I think those practices can be pushed all the more for greater participation, especially at the local level. So it provides that good example of policies. For the global call to action against poverty, we have been partners with the Millennium Campaign in the MDG era, and now we're partners with the SDG Action Campaign to bring the knowledge of the SDGs to communities, because GCAP as a global organization is actually composed of very strong national coalitions really working on the ground. So the grassroots base is quite huge, and therefore there is ability for mobilizing. But I guess what the partnership needs to be, needs to be more enhanced in terms of an education program, that really will tell the people what the SDGs first, what are they? What is it all about? Because it's quite complicated. For example, to translate the SDGs in the national languages or different languages is already a challenge in itself because it sounds so technical. Sustainable development is very technical in the minds of people, but if you are able to have, the popular ways of communicating the SDGs, I think it will be very useful. What we want is for the SDGs to be really framed within the human rights-based approach, because it's important for us not only to be able to expand the civic spaces, because the civic spaces, especially in Asia Pacific, are really shrinking. There are laws that do not prevent civil society or people's organizations' participation. So there's that kind of repression that is happening all over. There's violent extremism in some areas that have really prevented people from participating. So because you see, it's important to have the SDGs and the Agenda 2030, but these are nothing if there's no peace. So the struggle for justice and peace is something that's very, very innate in the SDGs, and we want to push for that.